Welcome to Introduction to Biology, Bio 105. In the previous lectures, you learned about genotype and phenotype. So remember, a diploid cells have two copies of each chromosome, and a haploid cell will have only one copy of each chromosome. Now, because diploid cells have two copies of each chromosome, they also have two copies of every gene, one set of chromosome, and therefore one copy of each gene. So one copy is from the mother over here, and one copy is from the father or from the sperm that comes to make the initial child. Now, diploid cells can have either two of the same alleles or two different alleles. Remember, alleles are the different forms of a gene. For example, here you have eye color. So an allele for a blue and a blue is considered homozygous recessive. Homo meaning same, and zygous referring to the reproductive cells produced from meiosis. And these cells are called homozygous because all of the reproductive cells, or the gametes, have the same identical alleles. Now, cells with different alleles are called heterozygous. Hetero meaning different, because they will produce reproductive cells that have different alleles of this gene. Now, Mendel used so-called true breeding plants, which means they always looked like the previous plants from the prior generations, and was selected over and over again over several years. So he had two varieties he chose of the pea plants, one that always had purple flowers and one that always had white flowers. So what did Mendel say about inheritance? He said from his experiments from the pea plants and the flower colors that the purple allele was dominant over the white allele. Stated another way, the white allele is recessive to the purple allele. In many, but not all cases, it is possible to pinpoint the phenotype to one allele. Remember, alleles are variants of genes, and genes encode for proteins. So, in this example, the purple flower may be due to an enzyme that produces a purple pigment. If the allele codes for a mutant enzyme that does not perform as expected, the resulting flower would be white. A flower with big P or big P little p genotype has a normal enzyme that will code for a purple pigment that can be produced. And even the heterozygous flower, which only has one allele for the normal enzyme, say a capital P, produces enough pigment for the flower to be purple. The small p flower, on the other hand, has no functional enzyme, so the flower remains white. There are so easily observable human traits that follow the Mendelian pattern of inheritance. Remember, us humans have two sets of chromosomes. Humans have 23 pairs, one from the father, one from the mother, and we have 23. We have sex chromosomes depending on if we're female, we get XX. If we're male, we get an XY. So one set of the wholes, one comes from mom and one will come from dad. Okay, so the two sets of chromosomes, we have 23 pairs, and each one of these, one will come from mom and one will come from dad. So there are some easily observable human traits that follow this Mendelian pattern of inheritance, which show dominant and recessive genes. For example, an unattached earlobe is dominant versus an attached earlobe, which is recessive. A widow's peak, hairline, and a cleft chin a rolling tongue, and a hitchhiker's thumb are other examples of dominant and recessive genes. Does the ability to roll your tongue make you fit for survival? No, not really. So one common misconception is that dominant traits are more favorable as an evolutionary point of view. And another is that dominant traits are more common, which we'll get to in a moment. They're not, though. So what did Mendel say about traits? He said that, according to the law of independent assortment, genes from one trait are not inherited together with another trait. The law of segregation, which he came up with, states that two alleles coding for the same trait separate during gamete formation. So the principle of independent assortment says that genes from one trait are not inherited together with another trait. So you have the genes which will line up during metaphase, and they will randomly assort to the various gametes and passed on to the different gametes because they're located on different chromosomes which are aligned randomly in the metaphase plate during meiosis 1. So inheritance of one trait has no effect on the inheritance of another trait. Now, we cannot stress enough that the traits, particularly human traits, are determined by complex interactions between genes and environment. And though Mendel looked at very simple traits that did independently assort, we now know that these simple observable traits were used to describe the patterns of inheritance are not necessarily what we see in human traits that happen all the time. The second law was the law of segregation. Mendel's law of segregation said that allele pairs separate and each gene goes into a different gamete. Now, this model that he tracked only tracked one gene or two alleles. So, very simplified form, but it helped us understand the concept of Mendelian genetics and the foundations of genetics as we know it today. Another thing he discovered was with these traits that the segregation of alleles and the fertilization were chance events and did not depend upon anything else other than random chance. So why aren't dominant traits always more common than recessive traits? Well, if a dominant gene is rare, it may continue to be rare unless there's some selective pressure killing off animals without it. Dominant and recessive simply describe how the two alleles interact with each other, not how common they are. So a dominant allele may be disadvantageous, in which case it would slowly die out. It might simply be rare, which most of the population has recessive alleles. So the dominant allele doesn't increase in number as quickly. So things to remember about dominance versus recessive.